Hello, everyone. This is Elizabeth Schriefer, and this is part 2 of Distance Learning, a presentation done for the ERP Training SIG as a part of Quest 2020. In our first part, we covered projects and information related to moving programs into online learning. And in this session, we're going to cover some of the top tips we have both from those experiences and many years of online learning. You'll see here that iLearn's turning 10 this year. That's me, Elizabeth Schriefer, a member of the Training SIG. And today we're going to dive into these tips in part 2. So there was our full agenda. Those first couple of bullet points we did in the first part, talking about how we moved programs online with a few different customers, including both implementation and software, ERP projects, and a business process change. Today, we're going to talk about those touch points of tools and scheduling tips, using webcams, all those sorts of things that really are kind of those top tips that we get mostly from our trainers, but a few from our PMs and things like that. So as we dive into our top tips, you'll notice that a lot of these slides are going to have a lot of words on them. I'm going to hit the highlights for you, but we'll have the PowerPoint available. Just reach out for us and we'll share that with us. So in those projects that we talked about in part 1, some of the things that we saw as huge positive, this is just a plus delta if you've seen those before, was the attendance was great. We found a lot of engagement with our online sessions, people very focused and working from home. Yes, we had some of the at-home interruptions that everybody's talking about on the internet, but student questions were very insightful. The learners and the instructors both skills increased on those fronts. The instructors got better over the course of these programs. Although many had been doing it for a long time, it was quite the intensive at that point. And we also found that small communities were established of different groups of learners who were tackling a different part of the process or something specific within the curriculum. The minus mostly came sometimes on the interaction. People were a little less open to doing their hands-on practice in different formats, using e-learning tools, sharing their screens, some of those sorts of things. On this point, we also found at times the Q&A could be inconsistent. That was pretty in line with times of day. So we saw that with lunch times where, obviously we started to lose people as we got closer to lunch, but we had high interaction in the early to mid-morning. So some of those things about when can you best schedule your event. Not always in practicality does that work out, but there's some recommendations on that. Engagement was uneven. We had learners who struggled to be online, so we do keep that on our radar. As certainly with most of our programs, we needed our entire audience to be successful. We also found that chat and open lines received mixed reviews. So while we like chat and we like the open line, there were learners who felt like it was a distraction, like people being able to just shout out their question in the middle of the session was not helpful for them. So those were the things that we heard. So my most favorite and the trainer's #1 most favorite component of all that we did in this tips and tricks was that they loved their facilitator. So that was the most popular component. So remember that facilitator can launch your session, do the welcome, they monitor the chat, they can speak and deliver a topic if that's how you've divided it up. But across the board, regardless of what we were doing, this was one of the top ranked features or components of what we did online. Everybody loved having that facilitator. So one of the things that facilitator helps with is your opening logistics. So this is going to be our set of tips. #1, make sure you're getting online before your students. 10 to 15 minutes would be our recommendation, at least 30 if you've never been on a particular tool before. Make sure that you're treating that scenario with 2 objectives. One, welcome everybody who comes into your room, just like you would say hello and make eye contact if someone came into your room. Do that in this case. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. And then also just make sure all that audio visual is working. One of the things we know with systems training is that you do time out in many cases and little web pop-ups and things like that, but at least give it a shot. Make sure that you're logged in before you get rolling. You may know you're going to time out, but usually in that case, it's just a simple re-login versus finding your shortcut, locating your bookmark, etc. If you have other presenters, make sure they're showing up early as well. As you're doing that opening, make sure that you keep it short. People are ready to get to business online. Most have sat through many, many openings that are long, so get to business quickly. There's some averages on the screen that it takes people 5 to 10 minutes to get started. A lot of people like to keep that to 5 minutes, which is primarily your agenda and your logistics or the rules. And we'll talk about online rules here in just a moment. Do use an agenda and objective slides. Return to it as you need to. Just like the meeting best practices in part 1, those are best practices that you would use in your classroom, and they're very effective online. If you have a repeating team or a repeating classroom session, you may not need to do all of the opening the same way each time. You may say, hey, just as a recap, we've done X, Y, and Z, and today we're on A, and off you go. So gauge your opening based on where you are with your curriculum and with your audience. On your materials, a great way to handle materials is just to send them beforehand. Make sure people have them in hand so that you're not getting 19 chat sessions that say, can I get the copy of the PowerPoint? Can I get a copy of the PowerPoint? Can I get a copy of the PowerPoint? If you're not going to email them out and post them online, then maybe they're on a SharePoint site, etc. Maybe just take a screenshot or navigate to that location and address that up front as to where the materials are located for your particular session. If you need to make any updates, you've learned something during your session and you need to make updates to the content, make sure you share that, then resend and of course repost out to the sites where you share your materials. Technical tips. If you haven't practiced your webcam, starting it live in the session isn't a great place, but as we mentioned in our part 1, a great place for your webcam is in your introduction. It could also be before even people have their official start time, your smiling faces there welcoming them. So use the webcam strategically. If you're having an open forum discussion, seeing a smiling, nodding intense and or integrated type format, you can see people's faces and they'll feel more open for that discussion. You might also do it at the introductions, again, that face to the name concept. Then after that, if you're demoing software, marking up a business process flow, etc., it's a good idea to hide it so it's not distracting from what's going on and you don't get any of those people walk out of the camera or do something on the camera that they probably shouldn't be. And then the big one on the bottom is have a backup plan. That facilitator can share their screen, use a different login, have multiple logins, have a plan to have a student share a screen, have a backup time slot if needed, although we don't necessarily say those as it sounds somewhat negative. Have an extra computer. I was teaching a how to teach on the web class and actually went down on a computer that was having some issues, and I had my backup up. It was already logged into the web meeting and it was ready to go, so we transferred that over. So just have a backup plan and a plan for notifying learners, which is usually just via email. Some people even include a slide like the colorful one to the right on something they can put on the screen if they are having technical problems. When you share an application, and we're ERP training SIG, right? So this is a lot about systems-based training. Make sure you're sharing the live applications. A lot of times people get very nervous and so they punt and they go to taking screenshots or using an e-learning tutorial. While that is great in certain scenarios, let's say you need to run MRP, you may need to use a tutorial or some slides because you can't run MRP in the time frame or you can't run it more than once, right? So the first time you ran it, you don't have that anymore. So you need to think through that. But if you can be live, go ahead and try and be live. It's much more engaging. It's more natural to the learner and to the instructor, and you'll get better retention by them watching the actual view on the screen. Log in as early as possible, Alt-Tab to get to those multiple applications between your presentation and the actual live piece, and then use the features. The biggest one that gets the highest engagement ratings is really just marking up the screen. So find your highlighter or your pen, and as you're paused on a screen speaking to it, just use that pen and actually mark up the screen so that somebody might call attention to something. So for example, I might say, reverse highlighting is a great way to point out text. And I might throw that up there. I mean, don't forget that you can Alt-Tab as often as you need to back and forth, and it will remember where you are. So you can use that. You could also do a markup. So if I was doing, step 1, step 2, step 3, I could label things. So a lot of times the other piece where I will do this is I'll have a workflow and I'll say maybe we are here right now, you guys. We're on step 2. And that's just that visual anchoring, that visual cue of where you are within your application in the business process that you're sharing. So use those pens and tools. Good thing to practice beforehand. I just mentioned anchoring content. Most simple construct for that is, what have you been talking about? Where are you right now? And where are you going to go next? So that's business process flow context, that's basic agenda context, whatever context you want to give to it. It's just the bookending theory. Where were we? Where are we now? And where are we going? Using those simple words online can really anchor or call attention to your next step. So if I kind of got lost a little bit, that I know where I was, where I'm going next, what I need to review. Also, if you are teaching something with multi-complex topics, right, it gives the opportunity when you pause to anchor your content for somebody to say, hey, whoa, 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 before you move on, can we go over X or Y? So it's a great check-in piece there. Do make sure that you check in with everyone, that they can see the content and that you moved your screen. So one of the pieces with that that's always interesting is if you share a particular application within these web tools, you can't share multiple. So a lot of times we encourage people, just share your desktop or a screen, a monitor, whichever one. And that way when you toggle between screens, then you will be able to capture all of that in your recording as well as your learner can see it. Last little tip here, and this is one that I have as kind of a peeve for, I guess, but leverage your corporate templates. It's always interesting when somebody joins a session and they're like, oh my goodness, why is that person using pink today? So unless it's themed that makes sense with what you're delivering and supports what you're delivering, you really just want to stick to your corporate template so where it's not distracting. For your hands-on practice, you're really looking to get to that bullseye, that target. So this is not a more is better type scenario. This is a targeted practice is the most important thing, particularly for your online program, right? We've got some just constraints there. So we want to make sure our practice is targeted. What will they practice? When can they practice it? Right then while you're talking? Should they be following along or should they be just watching you? If they are following along, do they have to have a double monitor, which is something we recommend if people are going to truly try and stay in sync with you. So think through the logistics of your hands-on practice. If they're using a data set, right, they need to enter a particular order type or a supplier buy a particular product. Is that in their exercise packet? So should they have had it printed? Do you want to project that on the screen? A lot of times when we have moving parts within an implementation, we will project the data on the screen since we don't have the opportunity to print it prior. So just make sure you've thought through the logistics of that hands-on practice and that you are incorporating it into the session. When you work with the audience, people need to hear themselves and hear each other speak. We know that at the retention charts, or looking at the retention charts, that to get up into those high levels of retention in the 90+% range, that people need to be able to articulate the concepts with which they're working. And then hopefully we'll get to that on-the-job knowledge transfer that comes later. One of the things I do here, and I'm just going to use my pointer. This is something you can do while you're working. Just use your cursor. Notice I don't touch my cursor many times while I'm on the screen, but use it to point something out. And the big tip I have for you while you're working with your audience is track who you're speaking with. It's quickly easy to know who's talking a lot, right? But who's not talking, right? Are they engaged? Can you see if they're engaged via your tool, or just reach out to them? Doesn't have to be something you call them out with, like, hey, do you know the answer to which one of these, blah, 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 or something along those lines. It can be as simple as, hey, so-and-so, how you doing? Hey, so-and-so, were you able to complete your transaction? That sort of thing, something casual. A lot depends on the politics and culture of your environment, but I would encourage you to monitor who is participating. Obviously, in training, I'm thinking you have a smaller audience. It's huge. You could use the chat and your facilitator for some of this check-in. You can also ask folks to expand things further. That's a great non-confrontational way. What do you think? And do you have anything to add? Have you seen this before? Are all great engagement type questions. And then if I'm not getting questions, one of my favorite tips is when I was doing this previously or while I was practicing this type bullet here, I had this experience. And sometimes sharing one of those types of experience will expand your audience's view as to what they might be willing to share, and then also having heard it brings down those barriers. So let's say you had a great session and you're running just a little bit late. Monitor your time very consistently. Make sure that if you're not going to cover a topic that you're articulating that to your students. But most if you've prepped and you've scheduled your time, then you should be pretty close to wrapping up. Make sure you give yourself a couple of minutes to wrap up. My rule of thumb is I give myself 5 unless I have a planned review activity that I want to execute. Recap your learning objectives and your agenda. Remind students of everything they accomplished in your session, and then some important follow-ups. Where can they go do that practice like we talked about? Do you have any open items that people either need to take action on or that you're going to recap for them? If you have a survey or attendance requirement, and if you did record it well, where they will be able to find that recording. A lot of closing is logistical, but the importance of the closing is to synthesize that learning into this is what we accomplished and this is our next step. How we'll actually transfer that into the workplace, what our go live date is, maybe as simple as that. So closing the session, very important for completing the experience. So interestingly, and this actually got some questions when we did this live, distance learning doesn't necessarily need the trainer. And I put this in because, well, I called it distance learning. There's obviously e-learning and all these sorts of things out there, adoption platforms, et cetera. So when some people refer to distance learning, they may be referring to employee performance support tools or something as simple as a Captivate or a storyline construction. So make sure that when you're planning out your program, that if there are those either prerequisites, practice opportunities, et cetera, that can be individualized. If you're remote from another person, these may be a great option. You would need to change your communication program differently. So, for example, we have a large HCM rollout going on right now, and it's a drip campaign with the employees. It's a toolkit with webinar sessions for managers, and it's an intensive for our core team. So remember that audience, you can communicate and change and work with them individually, and distance learning could mean an e-learning in some of those cases. So the last piece here is that interaction really is the key to all of these, even the distance e-learning volume. Plan and verify your logistics. Make sure that you have built-in opportunities and time slots for interaction with the folks on your calls. Check in often, summarize often, anchor the content, use highlighting on your screen, and if you have the option, let someone else drive, right? Let a student share their screen and drive, or run through a piece of the curriculum, have another presenter so that we can hear another voice, and certainly make sure that you have that integrated practice, whether it's live in the session or post-session, that there's opportunity to practice. Thanks very much for these tips. These were very pandemic-based ones that we've learned through there. So if we can help you in any way, shape, or form, there's our website and our email, and we look forward to expanding our online programs even more so.